started now. Are we good on your end?
Yep.
Thank you so much. This session is focused on the question of infrastructure, which is kind of a broad and funny word, right? You know, a phrase I keep having stuck in my head is Steve Bannon's remarks to the eminent Hollywood reporter in the days before the election about a year ago, when he was talking about his kind of pet infrastructure plan for the Trump administration, and said it will be as exciting as the 1930s, right? Which is kind of an interesting statement because I know when I asked my grandparents who were alive in the 1930s what they thought at the time, they generally didn't talk about it as especially exciting, But one group that does tend to refer back to the 1930s with a certain quality of excitement is actually the cooperative sector, particularly the electric cooperative sector in this country. That was a time when there was both private initiative in communities around the country and public support from the Roosevelt administration to develop a kind of infrastructure filling needs that investor-owned companies wouldn't fill to provide electricity to 75% of the land mass of the United States. And now we're in a moment where I think increasingly we have to start thinking less in terms of the internet as a kind of nice toy for some of us to use, and more as a kind of essential infrastructure. And before his lawyers got to him, Mark Zuckerberg actually talked about Facebook as a utility, a social utility. And I think the lawyers were like, they're like, don't talk like that ever again, because we have this whole class of utility regulation. But really, as the interest starts to rise for very, very good reasons in trying to challenge some of the platform monopolies that are emerging around us, questions of infrastructure become really vital. And so this panel is a chance to discuss this in a really broad sense, to look at some of the infrastructures that have emerged around the online economy already in terms of intellectual property and policy, and then also to look at how some of these models that we've inherited, media platforms like Associated Press, a cooperative, can inform how we build going forward, and to look at how we can use existing political and policy mechanisms like cities and other and perhaps existing cooperatives to build a new generation of internet infrastructure that's really accountable, especially in a moment where protections are weakening against the corporations that are controlling access to the online economy.
Do you want to speak into the mic so we hear you on the street?
Oh, well, I was just finishing up. So thankfully that won't be recorded for eternity. But do you have slides, Ingrid? No, it's not bad at all. It's just a question of whether maybe we'll now that you're here, revert to the original order. I was going to reverse. Do you have them?
They're PDF on this guy.
That PDF
All
is
right.
so great. Cool. Okay. All right. So we were gonna flip the order around. Is it okay if we revert?
Sorry. I apologize for being delayed. The MTA and I had some disagreements. Insert joke about infrastructure here.
So.
Pop up in a second.
Should it pop up on the desktop?
Yeah.
Sorry. Is your USB stick real?
I sure hope so.
Try this side.
like violins warming up before like a symphony to play in the moment. Sort of this like, totally waiting, but just like walking. It's gonna be platform go up. Okay. Should I go into Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and again, apologies for showing up late. And thank you, Nathan, for inviting me. Nathan is a very good old friend. And I feel a little bit kind of out of my element. This is not, the cooperative side of platforms is not my area of expertise, but I'm really excited to get to learn from the other speakers on this panel. So a little bit about my perspective coming from this is I have been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years, more studying and doing kind of public kind of like education about network infrastructure in various forms. Sometimes that kind of looks like journalism. I spent a couple of years, 2 years ago, I spent a couple of months basically living in a truck, driving around America, visiting data centers and submarine cable landing sites and microwave towers in the middle of Kansas, and basically doing these feature pieces for The Atlantic about kind of trying to explain that the internet is in fact a real place and what that means and where it lives and why it lives there. I also sometimes try to stay a little more local. This is Networks of New York, which is a field guide to internet infrastructure in New York City, which basically I mapped out all of the different sort of components of the internet that you could see on a street corner in New York, because that's where I live. And at the time, you know, people weren't letting me into their data centers, so I wanted to try and find the internet on the street. So things like spray paint markings for buried utilities, manhole covers, things like that. This is an image of the second edition, which was published by Melville House last year. And in some ways, it's kind of just this sideways way to introduce a general public audience to aspects of sort of like who owns the internet and what are sort of the policies around how this stuff gets built, and you know how do cities use this, what kinds of surveillance mechanisms are kind of components of networks, but through this kind of like fun vernacular of like an illustrated field guide. And a thing that I've learned through doing a lot of this work is that as I rapidly sort of assume that these truths are self-evident, that they're also often very opaque to most people. And this was something I also kind of realized I was working on a project that I'll be showing you next with a friend around more kind of specifically education around infrastructure and like network systems. And you know, we were trying to figure out who our target audience was, like who are the people who don't understand how the internet works, and it turns out it's like literally everybody. Like these are all real answers, and they're all not completely wrong. Like there are at some level there are elves in a sense, but I think it's really hard to. I think it's really hard to convey to people the possibility of network systems being different if they don't understand how they actually already are, and so that turned into a project that I did in collaboration with my friend Surya Matu called Networksland, which is a curriculum development project. And basically it's different kinds of like hands-on, primarily analog activities. Oh, that's maybe not important. I kind of already said that. But so it's a lot of kind of like modeling objects and games and sort of interactive hands-on materials around material infrastructure, and then sort of core protocol components, like stuff like that is not necessarily part of what's considered digital literacy education. Like a lot of digital literacy, as many of you are probably aware, kind of consists of teaching people how to use a browser and maybe like set up an email address or think about privacy, but like a lot of it's kind of in service of being kind of a compliant consumer of networked systems, not necessarily an active agent in them. And if it is being an active agent in like a learn to code sense, it's kind of to be a compliant software monkey at Google. So this was just another image of the modeling kit. We really enjoyed making the wireless into the above level antennae thing. And then, realized that most people can't get bespoke, beautiful, flocked pieces of wood that we had designed. So we've been toying with kind of lower budget versions for some curriculum development work that we did for the city's Computer Science for All initiative. This is a game for packets, teaching kids how packet switching works. So they get puzzles, basically, of different things that you might see online, like newshorse.biz. And all of the packets are put in little envelopes and then mixed up, and they have to move the packets to the right places. It's like pretty silly, but it gets kids running around, and it's a way to kind of explain also just the, like once they go through the really tedious process of doing the last hop, you're like, aren't you glad computers are fast? Because you don't have to do that. And so I guess this was all a very, very quick overview of what that project kind of looks like, but I think it kind of, there are a few questions that we sort of are still kind of thinking about and that I hope are useful for thinking about how to make alternative models for owning network infrastructure, like stick with people or be a thing that they kind of understand, like a thrust, like why it matters. Because I think that one challenge is like there's not really a good place to teach this material. Like we don't know what subject matter we sit in. Like we did some work for this, like for CS for All, but they want to use it in a social studies unit. And mostly we've been able to workshop this in sort of after school environments. It's very much an elective piece of information, and it's not something that has a clear home as like a core component of understanding like civic life. And part of that's maybe just because it's a fairly new concept, but I think it's also kind of deliberately kind of broken out of these systems. The other question is, you know, like at what age you teach this stuff, because when we've worked with like middle school age kids, like they have a lot of really good questions. Like the number one follow-up that they want more information on is like, where did the internet come from? How did it start? And like this isn't even, that's like not even really well integrated into like basic US history. And I think the, you know, final thing that we're kind of certainly was like thinking about beyond sort of how it works, tools or activities for saying how could it be different? Like what's a way of kind of localized modeling of like alternative network models? Joanne McNeil and Dan Pfeiffer have a project called RNet that's a really good experiment in trying to build kind of like, basically like they set up a LAN with the kids and then the kids have to sort of set up the protocols for like what kind of interactions and behavior and what kinds of like content is acceptable on their network, which I think is a really like interesting kind of model to kind of, to kind of try and like show them like what running their own internet would be like. And I guess there was another thing that I wanted to bring up, and I think there's another thing that I didn't make a slide for, but I think is kind of relevant and maybe will come up in this panel, is I think the word infrastructure has been kind of aggressively abused in the last 5 years, I think, by the tech industry, insofar as like literally anything can be declared a component of infrastructure. I don't know how many of you read Mark Zuckerberg's like mission statement for Facebook from a few months ago, but he used the phrase social infrastructure about 13 times and never explained what social infrastructure is. And I worry about the ways in which this is the kind of like loose using of a term that means like fundamental to like the maintenance of everyday operations is used as a kind of a subterfuge for the political urgency of those particular systems. And I think that in some ways the loss of like the concept of public works for talking about these systems is something that as an educator and someone trying to, and communicator about technology, I think is really worth kind of digging more into. But that's all I have, and hopefully was not too far off of topic for this conference where I feel a little bit out of my depth. Thank you so much.
Leave it there for now, actually.
Or you did have slides, sorry.
So hi, my name's Jim Kennedy, and I'm the head of strategy for the Associated Press. And I guess my role here is the designated history hitter. A lot of people know what the Associated Press is. They just don't know, what it is. And whoops.
Do you want to use this mic? It might be.
Can you hear me now? Better? Up? Okay. So the AP is 171 years old, and it's been a cooperative from the start. And it's remarkable for its durability and its flexibility and its creativity over that period of time. My boss, the CEO of the AP, Gary Pruitt, told me not to tell a history lesson, not to give a history lesson, but I think the history lesson is actually appropriate because the way it started is certainly not the way it ended up, and it's gone through a number of twists and turns along, nearly 2 centuries. But the fact that, but I think as you'll see as I go through it, that the fact that it is a cooperative has been the critical ingredient to why it's endured so long. So the AP began back in 1846. A guy by the name of Moses Y. Beach had just bought a few years earlier the largest circulation newspaper in New York City called The Sun. And the big news story in 1846 was the war in Mexico. And it was really, really difficult to get the news from the war in Mexico from the front back to New York City. It had to go across the Gulf of Mexico in a boat, then go in Pony Express and the railroad, and ultimately to this newfangled thing called the telegraph, which had an endpoint in Richmond, Virginia. And it was a single-threaded utility at that point from Richmond to New York. So it wasn't like the internet in the fact that it wasn't ubiquitous. There wasn't ubiquitous broadband. It was a single-threaded telegraph line. So there was a lot of competition, and Moses Beach got this great idea that he could get an advantage on everybody else in New York if he somehow got a faster horse that could beat the U.S. mail. So he sent his son, Moses Jr., down to Montgomery, Alabama, I believe, and he found a faster horse, and he spent a lot of money to do that, and came back to New York, having gotten a guarantee that this new rider would beat the U.S. mail by 24 hours. And he showed back up at the Sun office, and he walked into his father's office, and his father had assembled 4 or 5 other publishers from New York. He immediately knew something was up because he recognized all the famous faces, and his heart sank, because what his father just said to him as he walked in the door was, "Whatever you got, we're going to share with these other guys." And so that's what happened. And the reason for that was a couple of reasons. One was it was pretty expensive. So they just spent a bundle of money on the fast horse, and they needed to share the cost of that. The other reason was the real infrastructure was the telegraph, and the telegraph, as I said, was this finite resource, and you literally had to wait in line to use it. And so what was happening at these choke points with the telegraph in Richmond and Boston and other places was that the telegraph, there'd be lines at the telegraph office for people wanting to use it. They over time had to implement a 15-minute rule where you could only use it for 15 minutes, and you had to get back in line again. But anyway, this was before the 15-minute rule, and so if you lined up, even if you had the fast horse and you lined up and you got to the telegraph office and there was a big line, you were screwed. So again. Sharing was going to help out in that situation because we would basically be filing one file of information as opposed to 5 or 6. So they shared the pony and they shared the internet in 1846, and that was the beginning of the AP. They had a very loosey-goosey arrangement that got solidified over the course of time. But it was, in a sense, the beginning of it was the basic model was cost sharing. Now, the really interesting thing was that a few years later, after a new guy came in to run the AP, they actually hired a guy to run it, and his name was Daniel Craig. It's not the James Bond actor. Daniel Craig in 1846. And Daniel Craig, he came to work at the AP in like 1848 or 49, and he started to work out deals with the various telegraph systems. And he actually managed to tie them together so well that the telegraph became more of a very regional thing where it had been a very fragmented thing. And he realized in 1851 that he could use the telegraph in a new way, not just to share costs and file shared news in a one-way direction, but that he could use the telegraph to syndicate content out to multiple places and get more content in from other places. So he created the syndication model. He turned a shared cost cooperative into a revenue generating cooperative. And so that is the model, as a matter of fact, that has endured all the way to present day. It's exactly our model. He created it in 1851. Story gets a lot more complex and murky as the 19th century unfolds. We fended off competitors. We worked out monopoly arrangements with Western Union, and eventually survived all of that. And in 1900, incorporated as a not-for-profit, and that's where things sort of got formalized. And it was incorporated under New York not-for-profit law as a cooperative, and that's that's the same situation as we have today, and that allowed us to continue to grow. And in middle of the 20th century, 1845-ish, we got in trouble again because we had established rules that kept other people out of the cooperative. So the newspapers in the cooperative actually could keep out their competitors, and not only their newspaper competitors, but now radio was coming along, and soon enough television, and the cooperative rules at that point were prohibitive. They could keep people out. So that got challenged. That got challenged in Chicago when Marshall Field, the department store owner, wanted to start a newspaper, and he wanted to get the AP News Report. And one of the Chicago papers, who was a member of the AP, wanted to block that, and that got challenged in 1843. And a judge, guys, picture that sort of imposing guy there. His name is Judge Learned Hand. That's a real name, Learned Hand. Decided that our bylaws were in violation of the antitrust laws, and that eventually got upheld by the Supreme Court. So it was a defeat that became a big victory for the AP because our bylaws were defeated, but what happened was that the AP was opened up to other newspapers and eventually other media, and we grew as a corporation. And so that's what propelled us forward to really have become a global network is that consent decree in 1945, because it opened up the cooperative to anyone, any retail news outlet that wanted to purchase the AP News Report. The keys to our success along the way, I tried to come up with a few that might be meaningful to anybody trying to think about cooperative structures today. And I came up with 5 things. First of all, dynamic leadership. This thing would not have endured for nearly 2 centuries if it hadn't been for really ambitious, creative leaders of the AP. There's only been a handful. There's been like 13 or 14 guys who've run the company over that course of time. And Moses Beach was the guy who started it all. But then Daniel Craig came up with the miracle business model. Melville Stone. Okay. Melville Stone is the guy who incorporated it in New York. Kent Cooper let other media entities in from radio and television, or Cooper brought in photography to the AP. Oliver Gramling brought in broadcasters, and then Lou Bacardi, who's relatively recent. He was the president of the AP in the latter part of the 20th century, and he brought in video and, of course, opened us up to internet and licensing our content outside of what was the traditional news business of newspapers and broadcasters. Access to innovation has, of course, been critical. The infrastructure part of it has been the telegraph, of course, was the organizing infrastructure of the AP in the first place. Radio, we tested Marconi's technology when it was first invented, and began to use that, and then opened up the AP to the radio business in the 1920s. Television came along. We moved into television. Along the way, we harnessed satellites to deliver the content faster than the telephone lines and telegraph lines could, and then eventually the internet. Now all of our content's delivered over the internet. Artificial intelligence is coming into play now because we're moving into the automation of news. We're automating text stories directly from data. We're automating video directly from text, and these new technologies are driven by AI. Creative business models have also been a key. It started as shared services, morphed into a syndication model, developed the idea of a membership and the bylaws that associated with membership. That enabled us to not just sell stuff to newspapers, but to harness their content as well and grow the content base. And finally, now we're working on customization to get away from just one-size-fits-all products and customized delivery of a package of content for each one of our customers. Partnerships. We wouldn't be here today if we hadn't struck a really sweetheart deal with Western Union, and we continue to work out key partnerships that help us move the company forward. We began in the internet age. We opened up the Cooperative to arrangements with the portals, so Yahoo and AOL and eventually Google. We work with all of those companies still, and the network effects have grown the company by 100-fold over the course of time, and now the thing that we say is that in the course of a day, half the world's population sees content from AP, whether they see it through a newspaper, a broadcaster, or an internet outlet somewhere around the world. We're in every media type, not just text, photos, video, audio, graphics, and data, and we're the foundational news report for almost every other retail outlet, certainly in the United States and largely around the world. There's other entities like the AP. There's other news agencies around the world. Some Germany, DPA, and Kyoto in Japan have copied our model, but we're unique. The cooperative model in the United States is unique, and I believe that it's the reason that we've been around as long as we have, and the reason that we survived the downturn that other news companies have felt, particularly newspapers, in the last 10 years, because we've been able to because of that unfortunate, then fortunate consent decree in 1945. We expanded the company and diversified across all the media types, and then we just made smart decisions. We got into video in the 1990s. And grew the company, about double the size of the company as a result of that. Began licensing content to internet portals, and where that was a major decision. A lot of disagreement about that. Along the way, the people who are sort of run the AP from point of view of the board of directors are largely newspaper companies. They're not owners. They don't own the AP. The AP doesn't have owners. It's not like a public company. It's not even like a private company. It's a pure cooperative that funds everything from cash flow. So everything we do comes out of cash flow, and anything that we make, any profit that we make, goes back into the company, supporting things like our pension obligations, our investments in startups. We make a lot of investments in startups today. Any capital improvements, and any growth in the company comes back. Is funneled back into the company from any margin that we make on the news services, and those owners, the newspapers, even though they've been troubled, have tended to make the right call all along the way, opening up the company to these other competitors, radio, television, and ultimately the internet space. Those were all tough decisions for that cohort to make, and they made them, and that's what helped the cooperative endure over all of that time, despite the downturn in the economy, despite other problems within the industry. So that's the history of the AP, and some lessons to be learned from how a pretty ingenious idea can endure over nearly 2 centuries, and we hope a few more than that.
So this is why I never stand behind the podium. And I'm wearing heels, so I didn't bring a PowerPoint, but I'm Deb Socia, and I'm the executive director of Next Century Cities, which is a nonprofit. It's a national nonprofit, and I work with 183 cities, towns, and counties all over the country that either have or want to have fast, affordable, reliable broadband. We're a membership organization. It's free to join. If you know a city that should or could join, I'm happy to talk to you about that later. I was listening this morning to the speaker talk about Stockley and what a cool product that is, and what a great opportunity for artists to actually get their work in front of people in a much bigger audience. And my first thought was, who's not included? Who's not included either in the audience or as people who are creators of material? And that's people who can't upload or download, can't get online. And sadly, that's an awful lot of people. So like Ingrid, I'm going to talk a little bit more about concrete infrastructure. And I definitely want to talk to you later, Ingrid, because boy, some of our mayors could really take your course and it would be very helpful to them. But nearly 30% of Americans that live in rural America lack broadband access. That is currently defined as 25 megabits down and 3 up. And that's not great, but it's pretty good for standard uses. But that's 30% of rural America. And the average price for a megabit in the US is $4, which puts us the 5th highest in the country, in the world. We are after Brazil, Slovenia, India. So it's very expensive and it's not ubiquitous. So it's not just a rural problem, we know this. And Jim, when you said the 15-minute rule, now there's a 30-minute rule in libraries in urban America to use broadband. And so we're back there again, and we need to figure out ubiquity. So you all know why we need to solve this access problem, so I'm not going to go over that at all, but I am going to focus on the rural issue. We do have solutions to this problem. The first one is we can let the private sector, did that just go off? We can let the private sector, think the big guys like Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, we can let them solve the problem with providing access. The big problem with that approach is it's not working, and there is no competition. So part of the issue here is that the private sector can invest money in a rural community and get X dollars, or they can invest it in a much more densely populated area and get factors higher in income back. So I get that. They're a for-profit company. Or we could wait for the private sector to come up with better infrastructure. There are lots of conversations about wireless and how it's going to solve all these problems, but I got to tell you, it ain't happening. And it sure as heck ain't happening in rural communities, right? If you want to talk about 5G later, I could talk for 2 hours. So there are alternatives, which is the interesting part to this story. We could let municipalities build them, and I'm really good with this option. By the numbers, this info comes from muninetworks.org. 95 communities have publicly owned fiber to the home. 77 have community-owned cable networks. 200 or more have publicly owned fiber in some part to their community. 130 have dark fiber that they own, and 110 communities in 24 states have publicly owned networks with at least a gigabit symmetrical offering. So I live in DC. I pay $120 a month for 25 down and 3 up. If I lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, I would pay half that price and have a gig symmetrical. So we can support those muni networks. We can support public-private partnerships. There are a few really successful ones in the country, like Ting in Westminster, Maryland, where the city and a private company have partnered. The city owns the infrastructure. Ting provides the service. They have a shared risk and shared reward model, and it works pretty successfully. The problem is it's hard to find partners. And they, too, are still looking to make a profit, so they're not as apt to be in private areas. But most logically, we can let co-ops solve this problem. which honestly makes the most sense in our rural areas, especially those that already have an electric co-op. Co-ops could take this on as they did with electricity. They can do the work. We know they can. They're good at infrastructure. They've been doing it successfully for generations. They are connected in the community. The community already knows and trusts them. It's a way to keep local money local, right? You build it there, you pay them, they're your neighbors, you get good customer service, not the 36 people I talked to before I could get my service switched when I moved into my apartment. I counted. I wrote down all their names. So, and not only that, but it helps the co-op because it really helps them with their smart grid and improves the reliability and efficiency in the network itself. So they should, of course, focus on the fiber solutions. It frustrates the heck out of me that we are paying big bucks in this country for networks that are using old infrastructure, old copper networks, and building technology on either end that maximizes that and getting paid a lot of money to do it. We should be building fiber. So there are companies out there doing this. There are companies that can help co-ops because remember who our co-ops are. Most of them have hair the same color as mine, the folks running these co-ops. Many of them are my age or older. They aren't all really comfortable with broadband technology. But they're smart business folks who've been doing this forever. So we need to help them figure out how to do this. And there are companies out there. There's one called Connexin that's run by Jonathan Chambers, who used to be at the FCC. And he talks a lot about how this can be done without public dollars. Right now, Connexin is working with 40 co-ops, running 100,000 miles of fiber, with $100 million worth of investment to 1 million homes and businesses in rural communities in this country. And they're doing it without public dollars. In rural Minnesota, there's a co-op called RS Fiber. It's one of my favorites. A group of communities got together and started this co-op. And because of the existence in fiber, a very tiny little rural community called Gaylord, Minnesota, is now going to have a medical school. I mean, great quality of life, and now you got a gig, and now you got a medical school. So another example of this, rural Kentucky has 5,286 square miles of fiber to the home created by co-ops. Would you have ever known that? I mean, rural Kentucky. However, we have given tens of billions of dollars to existing providers to build out in rural areas, and in fact, Connect America funds from the FCC give $5 million annually to incumbent providers in Kentucky alone, but they have hardly built any fiber to the home. Tens of millions of dollars a year. So where has that gotten us? It's gotten us not very far, all that investment in Connect America funds, and the reason it hasn't gotten us very far is because that money cannot go to a co-op. It cannot go to municipal broadband. It has to go to an incumbent provider. And if the incumbent provider doesn't want it, maybe somebody else can get it, but it's not that easy. So we have a history of empowering local communities find and solve their own problems. But we have created so many roadblocks in this country. One of the bigger ones, is that there are 19 states with either laws or barriers to building your own. And those laws and barriers apply to states and or co-ops. To cities and or co-ops. So for example, you might have heard recently about what happened in Fort Collins, Colorado. Last week, they are trying to build their own network, but in Colorado, you have to have a referendum that everybody has to vote on in order to allow that to go forward. So they did that 2 years ago. And then last week, they had another vote before the populace to ask whether or not they could bond $150 million to do it. Comcast spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to prevent that vote from going forward. Thankfully, it passed, I'm very happy to say, but those are the kinds of things that are happening in this marketplace that are maintaining a monopoly. So pretty much we're saying that an available solution from a reputable and successful provider cannot be used to intervene in areas where nobody else wants to build. So Tennessee eventually, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Wilson, North Carolina, challenged this at the FCC. And 2 years ago, Chairman Wheeler preempted the state laws that prevented them from growing their network beyond their boundaries. So it preempted state law. Unfortunately, it later lost in court. They were sued and it later lost in court. Ironically, North Carolina sued. So what's really interesting about it is Tennessee eventually did go back and change their law so that co-ops could build. The problem is that co-ops are held to a standard that nobody else is held to. And so again, we're kind of finding ways to empower and embolden incumbents and prevent our local solutions from working. Imagine what we could do as a country if we could take those tens of billions of dollars we're investing through the Connect America Fund and give them to local communities. We could literally incentivize our local communities to solve their own problems. And that would make the world of opportunities we've been discussing all day today here available to everyone. And I look forward to that day. Thank you very much.
How do I move it forward? Just,
Yeah.
good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hal Plotkin, and delighted to be with you here today. And Nathan, thank you very much for the invitation and for agreeing to moderate this. This is a bit of a polyglot panel in that the infrastructure elements that we're talking about kind of all interrelate but are all very different. Although I have some connections, it turns out, with some of the people on the panel. Mr. Kennedy would be amused to know that I was for 25, some of you may know, I was for 25 years a journalist in my earlier life. I played a role in starting the public radio program Marketplace. And one of my first jobs at my first radio station was ripping the AP paper from the AP ticker machine and preparing our 5-minute hourly news broadcasts that nobody but my mother listened to on our small little FM radio station in our community. And Deb reminds me that the last time we met was a few years ago in the White House when I was working as an appointee of President Obama in the U.S. Department of Education, helping to oversee the Obama administration's investments in open educational resources, openly licensed educational resources. So I'm coming to you today with kind of a list of opportunities that have dawned on me as somebody who's been involved in both media, journalism, and public service over the years, because like everybody, you know, if that old joke, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And having worked so long writing about public policy and then working in public policy, when I look at problems and I see an opportunity for public policy to intercede. I wanted to also offer you congratulations and encouragement for all of you who are involved in this platform cooperative movement. As some of you also may know, I was involved 15 years ago in the group that created Creative Commons, the open intellectual property licensing scheme that many people use for, and at the time I actually wrote the first article that was ever written about the idea that became, that was ever published about the idea that became Creative Commons about a year before the organization was formally launched. And the good thing is, it's very exciting to be involved at the early stages of something that you know is an effort that's going to have a global impact. And it's actually thrilling. Everybody always talks about that they want to be on the ground floor of something. And I'm old enough now to have been on the ground floor of a couple of things that turned out to be pretty important, and that is indeed a very heady experience. But it's also very daunting and in some cases frightening. You don't realize until many years go by how little you had when you started. and how much you needed, how much you thought would be there. It's kind of like going and grabbing for the handrail when you're getting out of a car, assuming it'll be there, and then only discovering when you stumble onto the ground that it wasn't where you thought it would be. Well, who wouldn't have put that support there? It needs to be there. You got to go back and build that elemental support. So I wanted to talk with you today about some ideas of projects that this community might consider and might pursue. Some of you may be already involved in these kinds of efforts, but I think there are enormous opportunities for public policy to accelerate the growth of the platform cooperative movement. And I was going to suggest a few at lightning speed, and then we'll quickly move to the opportunity to discuss and kick around these ideas. But also, I wanted to recognize something that I don't know if it's apparent to everybody here. But it's latent power that you have and that we have and that you may not realize that we have. How many of you know that collectively you are already the biggest purchaser of information technology goods and services in the world? It's true. Government, which represents all of you, government at the state, local, and federal level, is the single biggest customer for any technology company that exists in Silicon Valley. It's the single biggest purchaser of servers for and server-like resources for from companies like Cisco Systems. If they lose their government sales, they'd shrink and go out of business tomorrow. It's Microsoft's biggest customer. It's Google's biggest customer globally around the world, our governments at all different levels. So you have an enormous amount of purchasing power that hasn't been organized or exercised in any coordinated way, and that's really one of the great opportunities. It's such a large power that we don't even know how large it is. I'll tell you a very quick true story from early on in the Obama administration. Wonderful friend of mine who was the country's first CTO, Chief Technology Officer, a position that President Obama decided to establish and had never been established before. Anish Chopra, a Virginian, decided right after he came into office that he wanted to first get a measurement from the federal government of how much the federal government was spending every year on proprietary digital technologies. Software licenses, software purchases, all of these kinds of things. And so, you know, he sent out, using the full authority of the White House to request information. In this case, wasn't even directing public agencies to do things, which the White House has some authority to do. But in this case, it was just information gathering, trying to figure out how much does the federal government spend every year on these technology products, goods, and services, so that we could begin to get a handle on where the government was getting value for its resources and where there were opportunities for new efficiencies. And after about a year and a half of literally bludgeoning the agencies to try to pull the information out, and everybody responded in good faith and tried to pull out the information, finally came to the conclusion that it was unmeasurable. I mean, he went up to several $1 billion annually in the U.S. Department of Defense, but so many of the expenditures that the government was making on these kinds of digital goods and resources was buried in other contracts, consulting contracts, operational contracts, all kinds of things where the data couldn't be teased out, that at the end of the day, the U.S. government and the White House, after an assiduous effort to determine simply how much were we spending, couldn't even figure that out. It was such a big number. So what do we do as the taxpayers who supply all of those resources? What opportunities do we have to leverage the fact that we're providing all of these resources in order to arrive at a more equitable set of social outcomes? Now, the philosophical argument I'll go through very quickly because I think we all share it, and then I'll move quickly on to the how. But the philosophical and economic argument here is what's our responsibility, what's government's responsibility to address growing and appalling levels of income inequality? Because that's one of the effects of this enormous expenditures, so big that we don't even know how much the number is that it has fed the engine of economic inequality. It's no mystery, at least no mystery to read, that we have seen with the advent in particular of the software industry, software eats everything, as you know. That with the growth and development of the software industry, we've seen an enormous concentration of wealth. At one point in my career, I was a reporter for CNBC, and I remember going out early on in the early days of the internet revolution, and people saying that what was really exciting about the profitability of these software companies was that they could, make a product once and then sell it 1 million times, and they don't have any shipping, they don't have any inventory. It's digital products are extraordinarily profitable. So you end up with a handful of software entrepreneurs who become billionaires and who buy Hawaiian Islands and things like that, and who can import cheap labor, making up whatever stories they want to make up about non-existent skills gaps and shortages that allow them to cut their expenses on the labor side and increase the amount of revenues they retain for themselves and their shareholders. And then coincidentally, we have this explosion in economic inequality that has coincided with the growth of the digital economy. So these, if people can't connect these dots, which are sort of self-connecting, then it's very obvious what has happened, and that really, in my view, and again here I am with the guy with the hammer, seeing things as nail, that the only thing that could possibly correct this would be a smarter and more humanistically inclined set of public policies. So let me just run through a couple that just dawned at me, and I'll leave them up there for you to study. There are others that are opportunities, and I'll separate these into sort of things we could do literally right away. And that's the other thing, is that if I leave you with one message, and if you remember anything about this talk at all, it's please that you have more power than you think you have. I mean, I won't go into all my background and everything else, but I'm older than almost everybody in the room, perhaps everybody in the room, and I can tell you I've had, if you had told me when I was a young person that I'd end up working in the Obama administration White House, first of all, I would have told you there would have never been an Obama-like administration or an African-American elected president, and furthermore, somebody who was raised in a family on welfare and food stamps in a single-parent family would never once in a million years wind up in a position I'm. So let me emphasize to everybody in the room here that whatever you think is your horizon, the furthest you can go, is not even the starting place for where you could really take yourself and your political activism. In my experience, the main thing that's limited people's effectiveness as political activists is usually their own cynicism about what they think is possible or what they think is possible for themselves. And that it's when people open themselves up to the virtually unlimited possibilities that reside in all of us as individuals, that they tap their full potential of what they can achieve both for themselves, their families, and their communities. So I want to encourage you to understand that you have much more power than you think you have. And that a lot of that power can start at the local level. For example, one of the things that could be done is we could begin to advocate and implement, starting at the local level, policies that give procurement preferences to suppliers that are organized as worker-owned co-ops. Now, we already do this in many jurisdictions. There's a well-established pattern called project labor agreements that have been worked out by the trades unions that are effective in many communities. I was at one time the chairman of the board of the community college system in Silicon Valley, the Foothill De Anza Community College, and we had a big building program to build new buildings and facilities. And before we started out letting out the contracts for building the new science center, $54 million, something like that, new science center on our campus, we entered into a project labor agreement with the building trades unions. And basically we said, we're going to put these projects out for competitive bids, but the only people who can bid are going to be companies that commit to using union labor. And if they won't use union labor, they don't qualify. And so, of course, it was a little controversial. A few people, oh, well, that's going to raise the cost of the products. And so, but our argument was, these carpenters, these electricians, these plumbers, they live in our community. We need them to earn a decent wage. We need them to be able to pay taxes because the taxes support the community college. and it's not in our interest to pauperize everybody to save a couple of dollars on a public expenditure that we had ample resources to fund adequately. So project labor agreements are a well-established way that one of the only reasons that of the unions that have been decimated all over the country, that the trades are about the last women and men still standing in unionized labor besides government labor unions, because they've been able to work out through the good offices of some political officials these project labor agreements which prevent them from being undercut. So we could do a similar thing. And I would argue to you that it doesn't even matter that in some jurisdictions there might not yet be co-ops that are stood up in a position to supply these public contracts. Because one of the things I learned as a business reporter is that the sell side always follows the buy side. That's the way they say it in the trade and in the conference business. If you have the buyers of something at a conference, for example, all the people who sell stuff will come. And if you implement regulations that say our local school district is only going to buy services under these categories from, well, you can't say only, but we're going to grant a 5% bidder's preference for organizations that are organized as worker-owned co-ops, then you'd immediately have a reorganization on the supplier side. The capital would suddenly become available. We were talking about infrastructure and how you get capital. That's the other appeal I wanted to make is a lot of people here building stuff. But, and you know, we build it, they'll come. And if what you build is really, really great, maybe they will. But it's much better to have demand first, to prime the pump of the demand engine so that the suppliers are interested in funding. It's a completely different argument when you go to a bank or a finance organization or investors and you say, look, the Podunk, Unified School District, which has annual capital expenditures of $300 million, just said they're going to have a 7% bidder's preference for worker-owned co-ops. We need a loan in order to supply whatever it is that whatever goods or services that janitorial services or any of the sweet spots that co-ops are already organizing in. And the other good thing about these kinds of strategies is that you don't have to depend on our corrupt Congress and our corrupt national political system to affect this change. I got elected to a school board. A bunch of faculty members at the community college that I had gone to for 10 years in night school while I was working full-time organized a campaign on my behalf, and they got me elected. It cost $35,000. I became chairman of the board of a community college district that had combined a capital and annual operating budget of $1 billion. All of a sudden, they just hand you the gavel, and you're in charge of overseeing, along with 4 other trustees, $1 billion worth of public money. In most local jurisdictions in this country, school board elections, the winner in the local school board election campaign spends less than $7,000. If you can organize 5 or 6 of your friends in most communities, it may not be applicable in a big city like New York, but in most of the parts of the country, if you can organize 5 or 6 people to work together on a school board campaign or a city council campaign, you're an unstoppable force. And because the level of civic engagement is so dismal, and the turnout, in the election where I got elected, the turnout was 28%. I met enough people when I was working in a pizza parlor in our community all those years while I was going to community college. A lot of people voted for me who bought pizza, who just remembered buying pizza from. So the point is that you have the power to not change Congress or the Senate, that may be too much, but you do have the power to get involved locally in local government settings where you can enact policies like the ones that I've put up here. And I won't read them all for you. Maybe we can talk about some of them as we go on. And I just wanted to make one other point. There is another opportunity, and it's an opportunity to influence federal policy. And one of the things that I learned in my years in Washington is how much of the play sheet for both the Republicans and the Democrats come from a handful of think tanks in Washington, D.C. The Center for American Progress, the New America Foundation, on the Republican side, the American Enterprise Institute. None of them are doing any work right now, making any, to my knowledge, any substantive policy recommendations in any of the areas that you care about, that we care about. If you think about it, those think tanks get most of their money from corporate sources. So you can sort of understand how it all operates with a Venn diagram with just two circles. One circle is what's good for corporate America, right? And the other circle is what would be good public policy for that you could sell to the public. And the tiny little sliver where those two circles overlap are the kinds of things that you see those think tanks focusing in on. So they'll focus in on, inoffensive ideas that are acceptable to Google and Yahoo and all the rest of folks. But we have an opportunity to put a different agenda a different set of possibilities on their roadmap. That could be accomplished through a coordinated set of statements coming from people in this room and scholars that you're affiliated with that sends a message to the think tank community that if they're actually interested in making significant strides toward economic inclusion and economic reform that would lead to a re-empowerment of working families in this country, here are the issues you ought to be working on. And to call those think tanks out in a very public way. And another thing to do would be to build out a bit more and to help Nathan, who has started one of his many efforts. He does so many things, it's hard to keep track of them at all, but I don't want to mean to make more work for him, but maybe there are people in the room who could help him with this. But Nathan's already started a page where he's begun to aggregate policies from around the world that have or have been proposed or being implemented, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel in each jurisdiction. You can be able to say to the city council in Detroit, oh, here's the policy they put in place in Barcelona, and here are the effects of it, and here's how it's working. And as we begin to develop a policy toolkit, we would have more opportunities to transfer best practices in public policy. Again, to accelerate the demand side, to use this latent, untapped purchasing power that all of you represent as taxpayers and as citizens, and to make sure that that power begins to be used on the side of the scale that would begin to reduce rather than accelerate the economic inequality that all of our public resources have been fueling for all of these years. So I'll stop there, and then maybe we'll get a chance to talk more about the specific ideas.
Panelists come forward here and sit down and if we could just, is this on?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Okay.
If we could, if you all could pass the mic like a baton or a whatever the,
Let me mess with that one to see if I can.
yeah, one of those talking sticks, just to make sure that everybody can hear you and that it's recorded. Maybe I'll.
Test. If you hold it close like this, it works.
Okay, great. And we'll do the same for comments from you all. So I'd like to open it up to people who want to offer ideas. Please do your best to be brief because we have just about 20 minutes. But feel free to offer questions or comments. We'll do a few rounds of just individual comments and then feedback, and then at the end we'll wrap up with a kind of lightning round of any remaining comments. And I'll just keep a kind of list of people who put their hands up, so I'll try to catch you as best I can in order that I see it. Okay. Anybody like to start? In the back?
Actually, have a couple questions for Deb about the restrictions on municipalities and doing their own broadband. So if you're a town, if the law applies to you, if you're a town, but how low does it go? If you're, you can set one up in your house, you can set one up in your block, can you set one up in your community board area? Where do they draw the line as to what you can't do in terms of networking?
So if I had to give you my best guess, it would be as soon as you get noticed. Do you know what I'm saying? So if you're selling service, that could be problematic for a local incumbent who's losing money on it. They're not apt to notice if it's a small community. As it gets bigger, there may be a pushback on it, but the bans I'm talking about are predominantly toward municipalities and cooperatives. So if you're doing it out of your house, who's to say you can't get away with that?
I've actually got 3 points. They're all quick, and then the second one is like backhaul. So if they're restricting, if the net neutrality is out and they're the incumbent, what obligations do they have to give you special access at an advantage? What I'm trying to get at, is there a chance to make regulators make them give you access if you form your community network in your area as a co-op?
Well, the business data services piece in the FCC did not go forward. So they're currently saying that is not monopolistic, even though, quite frankly, it is. So could they say no to you? Sure. Or they could make the cost so high you couldn't pay it.
What I want to say to people who are taking notes, if you go to One Web Day, which I do, you'll find that I put a video clip there of Kathy Brown from the Internet Society addressing the Mobile World Congress in Shanghai, and she's saying to them, all the accumulated cellular operators of the world, that given the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, that they have to open their pipes to people who are running community networks from towns where they don't reach. Very good speech, and thanks.
Thanks. So one right back here. Was that?
Hi. So my name's Matt Kropp. I live in Burlington, Vermont, and we're in the very end of a smackdown, drag-out fight to divert the privatization of our municipal gigabit telecom into mutualization as this sort of fallback position. And so I just wanted to sort of get a sense of your thinking on this, because in many ways, we had this thing, there was all sorts of sort of scandal and became a political football. And one of my takeaways from that experience over the last 5 years of kind of organizing with this group, trying to, divert this privatization, is that, municipal is great when you have a government that's supportive of it, but it's extremely vulnerable to sort of becoming that political football. And so, what sorts of things can be sort of put into place to secure against that sort of politicization versus a co-op where if it's accountable to subscribers versus a municipality which has many interests, that it might be less vulnerable.
So interestingly enough, of course, Burlington's one of the earlier ones, and there were some pretty scandalous issues that came with it that related to public money. They are somewhat, really quite unique in that regard. Very few of the municipal networks have fallen into anything like what Burlington did. So I would say, because you are the unique circumstance in that, it's just not typical, and I don't think it's something that most folks have to worry a lot about. I think public ownership, local public ownership, is the best way to go, and if there is a co-op, it's a great alternative because it is public owned. If there isn't, then a municipality is also a good option.
Hi, thank you guys for your panel, and I really appreciate the diverse experiences that you guys have. So I'm thinking about the idea of leveraging co-ops as sort of integrating with existing infrastructure, right? So can you speak a little bit about sort of the range from in what models, are there areas where co-op isn't the best model? And on the flip side of that, how can we help identify factors that would lead to successful models of using platform co-ops?
Well, just in a nutshell, I think that the co-op model could be successful in a wide range of industries. What's missing, again in my equation, is the demand. If there were demand for a co-op search engine, if there were entities or buyers on the buy side where they were creating a market for it, then that would be a fine. So I would say that the co-op model fits any place where we can accelerate the demand side for it, because you have to have, it's a, you know, in some sense, it's, you know, the suppliers follow the purchasers. I mean, and so if you can, if you had in the Silicon Valley, for example, where you have a huge amount of janitorial services, none of which are co-op, that are serving all of the Silicon Valley, if there was a living wage ordinance which said that businesses over a certain size must purchase cleaning supplies from a worker-owned cooperative, then automatically that industry would just explode in that area because they'd have the customer base. So you can see how you could put those kinds of requirements on almost any category of public expenditure, and if the requirements were strong enough, then the market would grow. It begs the question of, it's something that this movement will have to figure out, is when we move forward with some of these public policies at the local level, and I think they will move, we're going to need a secure definition of what constitutes a worker-owned co-op. When we pass legislation that says the city of San Jose requires that companies under this that are serving the have to be organized as a worker-owned co-op, then people are going to say, well, we're a worker-owned co-op, you know, and you're going to have a lot of worker-owned co-op washing, you know, where people are pretending to be something that they're not. So we'll need a better definition of it. But wherever we can manufacture the demand, then then I think there's a potentially very healthy market.
Just add a comment about that from my history lesson about the AP. One of the limitations of a co-op is that you can't invent the next big thing, because you don't have the resources to do that. But you can be smart about harnessing the next big thing, and if you get early enough, we've done it a million times. The telegraph, satellite delivery, digital photography. We partnered with Kodak when the digital cameras were first invented. So that's the kind of opportunity to look for, because you're not going to be able to invent it yourself.
Hi, I'm Justin. I'm from DC as well as a few people here. But I have, since the election, I just assumed that the internet is going to go down any day. And so with the lack of news and credible news out there and the noise, I see an opportunity for youth to be able to do some community asset mapping and really get information from primary sources in the community through peer-to-peer networks or community wireless networks that aren't necessarily on the internet. So do you guys have any opinion on whether that's actually something that would be viable, or do you see any barriers there, or am I like completely looking at the wrong schema?
I guess one, I can't speak like with great expertise on like the viability of that proposal, but one organization that is kind of looking at some of the same questions is the Resilient Communities project that's currently at the New America Foundation. So that was a program that emerged out of Hurricane Sandy. The Economic Development Corporation of the City of New York got money from HUD to fund basically, like, it was sort of business, like, resiliency. They had a few telecom grantees, Resilient Communities among them, and their approach has been kind of building localized Wi-Fi networks that are explicitly kind of like both like lands that are sort of gateways to the internet, and about sort of trying to figure out like what can we do with localized networks. And they're very earnestly like working with like anchor organizations in the neighborhood to try and make it something that's like an asset for people who actually like live there. I mean, it's fraught, right? Because like federal funding, lots of red tape, lots of hoops. But there's something I think that like as an organization, they have like a really fascinating, like great ethos. Like, you know, they're going to talk to you about Grace Lee Boggs before they talk to you about TCP/IP. And it's been really kind of interesting to watch that develop.
Yeah, my favorite of her aphorisms is critical connections before critical mass. Yeah, I think is potentially relevant here.
Hello. This is actually a follow-up question to the question from the comrade in camouflage. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I've been there in the ground for the last month. trying to bridge kind of like the blue sky thinking that happens in a lot of these spaces and a lot of the very immediate necessities on the ground. But there is a spirit of we have an opportunity to skip a generation, so to speak, because we're rebuilding from the ground up. And given the state of affairs around the world, it's almost like there's always going to be times of crisis over and over again where we're going to have these opportunities. And as a matter of inspiration, if you were to say, this is kind of like my fantasy, or this is an inflection point, or this is something that I really wish could happen in order to drive. Do you have examples of that, of projects that are doing it very, very well, or people that are very close to achieving something that could be could drive a very significant change in the application of co-op or shared ownership in whatever field you're working on?
Oh, I was actually just gonna call out Rory because I know he's in the room. I don't know where he is. Yeah, because he might actually be a better person for you to talk to. He's been doing a lot of work on community-owned like mesh networking projects. So that guy. Yeah, there he is.
He's also on the question list, so maybe he can contribute.
Hi. Sort of tough to follow all these eyes turning at me suddenly. And my question has sort of already been asked, but I guess I've been handed the microphone, so I'll sort of try to re-articulate it. But yeah, I guess thanks for the great talks. My question was kind of mainly for Deb, but I'm curious to hear everybody's comments. I was just kind of maybe going back to the community networks idea, because as Ingrid mentioned, I have been studying a lot of these like mainly wireless community projects that are springing up. In addition to the resilient community stuff here in New York City, there's one called NYC Mesh, which for about $80 you can buy an antenna and put it on your roof and connect to a wireless community network that's spanning Manhattan and Brooklyn, and it actually has a connection point to the IX, the actual big, regional tier 1 network in Chinatown. And there's similar projects in like rural Spain and Greece and other places around the world. So I guess my question is kind of like, have you thought, why do we need to be so committed to these like large capital projects as like a limitation? Like for very small investments, communities, maybe even kind of like below the radar of the cooperative level, can just start to build out connections. Then when a critical mass is reached, then like for example in Spain, once they had enough users, then they kind of jacked into the more like tier 1 fiber network, but they started off by just people buying routers and putting them on their roofs.
So I've seen some mesh networks that have been successful. They aren't successful without fiber. At some point you got to get back to fiber. I have seen some that are successful. I don't see, there is one in Washington, D.C. that's been on and off successful, but it does require people that really are involved and engaged in it and really supporting it and keeping it going. What kind of speeds are you getting for $70 a month?
I guess the critical thing is that they're getting a gigabit donated from the IX, which is then shared over, right now it's like 300 users or something.
Right. And that's a successful model because you've got the gig, right, to start with. And then when it's shared, you still have pretty good speeds, even though you have that number of people. When you exceed that number of people, when you get too large a number, you get minimal return, right? So it has a place, and it really has impact on neighborhoods in ways that are really powerful. It's harder to scale unless you get additional support.
I guess I also think about that in terms of like, maybe your long game, because like with a lot of like mesh network projects, it's it's like reflashing like firmware on routers with particular like open source tools and like protocols, and like the companies that make those routers actually really don't like it when people do that, and like it's getting increasingly kind of like tedious to do, and like hackers are resilient and they'll like find workarounds, but there's something like to be said for like at a certain point, like if you're like gonna have to like be changing out your routers or constantly kind of fiddling to make it work, it would be kind of nice to just own the glass, like that's, or at least that's how I sometimes think about it. Like, yeah.
There's a really awesome, specifically to that point, there's a really awesome project. There's a really awesome project right now by an NGO based in Buenos Aires called Altermundi,
and they're working on a product called Libre Router, which is going to be an open source, open hardware, completely free to manufacture. So they're going to set up a contract with the manufacturer in China, but the plans will be able to be manufactured by anybody. So that will kind of work around this problem. But still, of course, then you still have to get enough people together to place the order and so on and so on. And also, just again, to Deb's point, like, yeah, just in all fairness, the Spain example that I was talking about ultimately did then graduate to a fiber situation, which they then reconnected they redid the wireless in this rural area once they got enough people to afford it. So.
Yeah, and just as I think the technical answers make perfect sense to me. Just as a sort of point of social activism, I mean, I've been doing it at that part of the game for 45 years, and I'm a big believer that people need to do what they can, where they are, with what they have. And you push that envelope as far as you can, and you get up to the limits of what you and your allies can accomplish. And then when you have that set of accomplishments, you look for the next way to break down but the big enemy, again, the one that I wanted to emphasize the most in my talk, is the futility of cynicism, of thinking that because you can't get to step 7, you don't start step 1. And you start step 1. And you go to step 2, and you get to step 6, and by the time you get to step 6, step 7 looks different. And so don't be your own jail. If somebody wants to put you in jail for social activism, let them lock you up and pay for the guard. But don't do them the favor of being your own guard.
Okay, so I want to really be on time here because we want to make sure you can get to the unconference sessions on time. So we'll now just run through quick comments. I see 4 hands up. Let's close it out at that and go.
I'm good.
You're good?
I'm good too. That's fine.
Oh, okay, great. That helps.
I'm trying to help you out.
I had a question about your thoughts with the fiber optic cable that Link NYC has put down. The city's actually getting paid. So that, anything you have about that's completely inverse of cooperative and community owned.
And then there was one more.
My question is just about, I guess, more the sort of social infrastructure side and the need for some sort of digital identity that's independently controlled. And also, I guess there's quite a bit of discussion about blockchain as a potential sort of foundational infrastructure. So just interested in any thoughts on that.
Okay, do you want to just go down the panel? Do you want to start from respond to any of those things or any last points you'd like to make?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I don't actually know how much revenue the city has actually made thus far from Link NYC. If you have those numbers, I would be curious to know. And it's sort of a Faustian bargain, right? Because they're getting that revenue from ad sales. Which are, we can talk later about there were changes made to the privacy policy, but then they changed them back. And it's anyway. To the social infrastructure question, I'm not sure I totally understand entirely what the question is, but I'm curious to know what. I keep answering questions with questions. I'm sorry, but when I mentioned the term social infrastructure when I spoke earlier, I don't know if I know what Mark Zuckerberg thinks that means, and I would be curious to know what you think that is, because I think there's also and it sounded like we were speaking about social infrastructure being an instrument of identity, and in the United States we call that social security, and I'm curious about the ways in which services get transformed into these other kind of instruments for being able to participate in a particular kind of corporate structure, but that's maybe just answering your question with a concerned role. I'm sorry.
So I will just say I don't know enough about Link NYC to tell you much about it. What I can say is a lot of municipalities that own excess fiber do lease it, which goes back to the community in increased services. And so in some ways it's no different than leasing any other asset that the community has. If you're concerned about what they're leasing it for, that's a different conversation that I'd have. rather than leasing public rights of way or public lease agreements. In terms of the other comments that were made, I just want to say how much I appreciate your comment about not sitting down and waiting for somebody to solve your problem. The issues we're talking about are issues that get solved because people get mad and do something, not because we sit and wait for somebody else to come fix it. And basically what I tell my cities all the time is there's no fairy broadband mother. She's not dropping in and solving your problems, so start working on it yourselves.
Just a quick comment about the blockchain. I think blockchain is a protocol that has a lot of promise, and it's kind of like the World Wide Web in the early 90s. They don't really know exactly where it will take us and what it can do, but I think it holds a lot of promise for syndication models and networking models going forward. So I would recommend really exploring that.
Fantastic. Well, let's thank all of our panelists and everybody who contributed to the discussion. I found this really useful. I've been fantasizing about this panel for months now, so my fantasies are fulfilled. And I hope we can continue this conversation. One way to do that is on that discussion list. Go forth to your unconferences, please.